Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being at our February program of Agenda Alexandria. Many of you I know have been here before, but for those of you that are here for the first time, we're in our 21st year here in Alexandria discussing hot topics and issues that affect our community. And tonight, I think we have a fabulous panel ahead of us discussing public safety tonight. And we're very fortunate to get the police chief and the fire chief here in the room tonight. So before we get on with the program, and I'll introduce our moderator in a minute, I'd like to take a moment to ask the board members of Agenda Alexandria to please stand up and thank you for all your great work you do to keep our organization rolling. As many of you know, Alexandria is a community where people get involved, and so we wouldn't have this great program without all these volunteers. And we're always looking for new board members. So if anybody's interested in joining the board, we might have some spots open next year, and we'd really appreciate it if you'd be interested in stepping up and discussing that. Let me thank some of our sponsors, if I may. Simpson Development, Honest Air, FMK Financial Literacy Center, Janet Barnett, State Farm, and Networking and Engineering Technology. So how about a round of applause for all of our sponsors? And we also want to thank the T.C. William Broadcasting Club who broadcast this. Now, tonight you will, in about 4 days, this is all available on YouTube TV. So a lot of the citizens of Alexandria, if you're not in this room, we still get hundreds of people watch these programs. And so any of your neighbors that missed this tonight, just let them know they can go on to Agenda Alexandria YouTube.
Anyway, thank you for being here, everybody. February program, we planned this program last summer after reflecting upon sort of some of the events that had happened in the past couple of years that involved our first responders. They're first responders, and they don't know what's going to happen, right? And of course, we'll remember what happened at Simpson Field in 2018. But the fact is the day-to-day work they put in on our behalf is not really understood that well by most citizens. They are not a large part of the city budget, but they're a significant and an important part of the city budget, what's being spent on their protection of our well-being every day and our property. So tonight we wanted to sit down and talk about that. I can't remember, and I've been around longer than I care to admit to most of you, where we had both the fire chief and the police chief on the same stage, so to speak, talking about issues that are of concern to the citizens. So to my left, your right, is Chief Michael Brown, who joined the city in 2017, right, January? Just to his left, right, Corey Smedley was named permanent chief just last month, December 19. And you have the distinction of being the first African-American chief of our fire department, long overdue. Next to Corey is Jay Johnson. A lot of you remember Jay or know him because he's been active in Del Rey for a very long time in all kinds of capacities, including as chairman of the Traffic and Parking Board. So if you have a complaint about a stop sign, you can still blame him about it. But Jay is and has been for more than 25 years, the sort of driving force behind the city's volunteer firefighters. And lastly, on the end, is a non-Alexandrian, but we wanted to invite somebody who could bring a perspective from outside the city. Delano Reid is a 30-year veteran of law enforcement, longtime police officer in the Bronx in New York, also assistant director at the ATF dealing with weapons issues, and we're happy to have you here to be able to sort of offer an outside perspective. So you have cards on your table to write questions on. I'm sure you're going to have some, but I wanted to start out sort of on some basic issues, because how many of you here think you know everything you can know about the police department in Alexandria or the fire department? Raise your hand if you know everything. Okay. Well, you're very brave. I'm not going to ask you to explain what you know, but let's start with Chief Brown, because I want to lay out some basics before we start into the questions. Chief, how many officers in the department? That's number one. Number two is, I don't think most people understand how the city's organized every day in terms of sectors and how many of your officers are serving at any given time in the 3 8-hour shifts that exist. So, I mean, what's the organization of the department like?
Well, good evening, first of all, and it's a privilege to be here. The person that raised her hand over there, that's Jenny Obramovich. She's our volunteer coordinator, so if any of you are interested in ever being a volunteer with the police department, that's the person you want to talk to, or Richard, her husband, again, living legends of Alexandria along with Frank. So, and whenever I want to know what's happening in the police department, I go and talk to Jenny. Your police department is comprised of about 319 filled positions right now. We're authorized about 312, but we're in an overhire situation largely because starting in 2010, we lost about 45% of our staffing, and it turned over. So we were in a process of hiring, and the city gave us, or blessed with the ability to do what's called overhire. Because when you hire an officer, it takes about a year to train them, and so the overhire allows us to keep people trained. And right now, we're in an overhire situation. In other words, there's no vacancies in the police department. We're one of the few agencies in Northern Virginia that has that problem. In addition to that, we're still recruiting. We still have people that come in and hire. And in addition to that, we also have a waiting list, or at least we did last spring and into the fall. And we anticipate we'll have a waiting list as well. So we're very, very blessed, largely because of the service that the men and women of the agency have done, and frankly, the reputation that this agency has. The department itself is, we deploy, we have an investigations division. We also have patrol, which is the basic face of the police department, which many of you see. We have about 140 people assigned to patrol. And of that, we have people doing community outreach, and they're assigned to various areas where they try to network and establish a relationship with the community. We've doubled the size of that over the last 3 years, now that we have the staffing to do it. And then we have patrol itself, and patrol is, as Rod pointed out, deployed across the city. We have beats in 3 sectors. The sectors are Old Town, sector, which is Sector 1. Sector 2 is Del Rey, and it also includes Chilagua and Arlandia. And then we have the west side, and in there are beats where we have our officers assigned. We have a variety of issues across the city. I'm sure we'll get to 1 or 2 of those that always pop up, traffic and parking, especially in the Del Rey area. But in addition to that, we also have a rather very diverse community that we serve, especially over in Sector 2 and also along Sector 1. So we spend a lot of time responding to calls. Our calls for service have gone up a little bit. Some of our crime stats in Part 1 and Part 2 have gone down. We have a problem, quite frankly, with assaults and batteries. And most of those are...
What are Part 1 and Part 2?
What's that?
What are Part 1 and Part 2 crimes?
Part 1 crimes are basically your 7 big ones. That's homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, things of that nature. The Part 2 crimes are often called nuisance crimes. Drunken disorderly, petty theft, those kinds of things. But when you get down to looking at the crime across the city, we live in a very safe community. The biggest issue we have right now is a lot of it's happening, frankly, with people who know each other. And they get into domestic issues and things of that nature. We're in the process of finalizing our data for Part 1 and Part 2 crime and crime data across the city. And that'll be released around March 15th when we have to submit it to the FBI. And we'll have an analysis so you can all take a look at what we're doing in greater detail and some of the things we're going to deal with and how we do that. Let me just also say that patrol on a weekly basis looks at the activity across the city. And that is not only the calls for service, but also the complaints we get in. And they adjust their patrol staffing and their patrol deployment and where they target based on that every week. And so, if you call or use 311 to get information to us on the non-emergency number, or if you call 911, that becomes part of the weekly analysis that's done by patrol. And they make adjustments accordingly. I will tell you, I've been around cops a lot of years, 45 years to be exact. And I will tell you, I've seen a lot of different agencies, and this is one of the finest agencies I've had the privilege to be associated with. And you're very blessed to have this police department. The men and women here do it because they have a heart. So,
Thank you, Chief Brown. Appreciate that. Chief Smedley, I know you're not really new to the Alexandria Police Department, Fire Department. You were here for several years beforehand. Before that, you were in Maryland, right, in PG County.
Correct.
Right? But
Correct.
you've been here for quite some time. You've seen some of the organizational changes, management that were implemented by your predecessor, and now you've got a situation where, I mean, the city's first responders are always sort of adapting to new threats. I mean, think about the coronavirus. We'll get to that maybe as a question. But as you've now settled into the job of being part of the leadership of the department, how would you describe sort of what you see your challenges are relating to the community? Because a lot of people just take, frankly, the ambulance service for granted. Until someone has a heart attack or is in a car accident, they don't understand what goes into that cohort of officers, not officers, but of personnel who, like the chiefs, they're on call 24 hours a day, they're in shifts. How does that work for your department? How do you deploy your personnel? What are they expected to do? And what do you think your greatest challenge is in terms of managing them?
So thank you for that. So I've been in this business for 25 years, and the city of Alexandria is a diverse jurisdiction. It is only 15.6 square miles and just under 160,000 residents. Many more visitors that come into this great waterway to the historic districts, and then a lot of the economic development from shopping, commercial, restaurants, et cetera. So Alexandria sits in the heart of traversing from the south to Washington, D.C. So although we understand our jurisdiction and the culture of our jurisdiction, it changes from the morning to the night, because this is kind of a gateway to Washington, D.C. So we have to, in the fire service, be conscious of that. Our normal fire-related education, prevention, and different efforts like that have to be revisited. So one of the things that I'm looking at is really understanding what our makeup is when it changes throughout the day and throughout the season, so that we can ensure that the measures that we're putting in place to stop the call from happening is communicating to the audiences that we have to serve. So that's one thing. We're 24/7, just like the police department, and our personnel work about 2,912 hours a year. Normal business hours for work years, 2,080. So we're working 900 more hours. So when you're looking at customer service and the fatigue factor, we have to look at ways to help with the quality of life of our personnel, so that all the different traumas that they encounter that's compounded doesn't impact them at home, them at work, which impacts the community that we serve.
Give an example of what you're talking about. You're talking about 900 more hours. That must be collectively over the course of the force, right?
Of the year.
Yeah,
so
the year.
each person, we have just under 300 personnel in the fire department. We have 3 shifts, A, B, and C shift. Each of those shifts, our minimum staffing is 70 personnel on each of those shifts. Each person works 2,912 hours a year. So when you look at the normal work hours of a business situation, that's 2,080. So that's where I'm talking about. Each individual works an additional 900 more hours. You compound that with a lot of the physical activity, going into what we call IDLH, which is immediate to danger life and health atmospheres, fires, traumas, et cetera. That has an impact on our workforce, which inherently has an impact on our community, because those are the same people that's going out continuously trying to assist you. So my effort is to do things so we don't have to come, to educate you, to partner with you, just like tonight, so that we can get ahead and be proactive and not reactive in our fire service.
Okay, thank you, Chief, laying the groundwork on that. Jay, I know a little bit, but only a very little bit, about the group you've been involved in for a very long time. I know that you haven't been around long enough to be here since the founding of the Volunteers, but I know the Volunteers have been a fixture of Alexandria for a long time, maybe dating back to the 19th century.
Yeah, 1774.
Okay, well, longer than that. So you definitely weren't here. But Tell us a little bit about sort of how large your group is, how large has it been, but also I think clearly you guys, your group supplements what the sort of full-time paid personnel do. I don't think your members get paid, but I mean, tell us about their training, what they do, what their value is to us as citizens, but also I know a lot of the volunteers are actually based here in Delray because the headquarters used to be at Firehouse 2 on Windsor Avenue.
Right.
I mean, what does it mean in a community to still, in a sophisticated time when we're all, inside the Beltway, city of that's a lot of affluence, we still have a large cohort of volunteer firefighters, which almost seems like an anachronism. I mean, what's their value, and how do you defend still having that?
Well, our value, we used to save the city over $100,000 a year. Excuse me. We used to save the city over $100,000 a year. We have 4 different classes of volunteers. We have a Class A that is a firefighter EMT, a Class B that's just a firefighter. We have a Class C rescuer, which
Can
is
you hear Jay?
Which is
Can
a
you hear him?
which is a paramedic EMT, and then we have a Class D that will do dispatching or admin work. And the consistency of the training on a Class A firefighter is the same as the paid. There's no difference. A Class B has everything except EMT. And we use this Class B to get people started because a lot of people are just not for EMS stuff. They want to be firefighters and that's it. But we try to get them to be a Class A, and we don't allow them, the Class Bs, to go into a burning building until they fully complete their EMT. That's an incentive. But they can do a lot of stuff outside, outside the building and doing all kinds of things, with, putting water on a building, getting equipment, raising ladders, pumping. They can do all that kind of stuff. And then we have, like I said, we have people that are riding on the medic unit. We have like 5 retired paramedics that just recently retired in the last 2 years, and they are now volunteers. They want to keep on serving the city, but under their retirement plan, they had to retire. But they now are still a member of the fire department. They're just volunteers. And then, of course, the Class Ds, they can be busy with either dispatching, doing community outreach, doing anything inside the office. So we have a lot of things that we can contribute to the fire department and to the city. And we also help the police department on a lot of the summer events. We used to help the police on DWI checkpoints. We used to provide canteen services with them. We have a canteen unit. We also provided EMS just in case a person that was arrested for warrants or whatever did not want to go to jail, so they said, I got a problem. I'm having a heart attack or whatever. We would be there to make sure that they weren't having a heart attack and make sure that they could go to jail, and stuff. Because a lot of times they'll do anything not to go to jail, okay? So we provided that. And we provide a lot of stuff, like I said, events where we help with the turkey trot, we help with the birthday celebration and all those type of things. So that's a lot of things we do. And we, like I said, we normally save the city when we're fully operational, in a year, we save over $100,000 in value to the city. So what else?
We'll get to what else, but thanks, Jay.
Okay.
I do want to hear more about why you may or may not be collaborating so much anymore with the fire department or the police department. We'll get to that.
Okay.
And maybe the audience will have
But
questions
I've been a
about that.
volunteer for 43 years, and I'm a second generation. And I've been the president of the volunteers since 1984. So, and also I was on the traffic and parking board for 28 years. And most of the time, either the chairman or the vice chairman. And the reason why I was put on the traffic and parking board was people didn't understand that what a fire truck can do and what it can't do. And a lot of times people say, I want this on this street, or I want this. And fire trucks or medic units just can't do that. So the council asked me if I could be on the traffic and parking board to represent the fire department so I could be an advocate and a voice to the fire department to make sure that the fire department can do their job. Because a lot of things out there that people just don't think about. And so I'm there to make sure that they understand why we can't do this, or, But I retired on that, and but anyway, I do help the traffic park board. They'll call me and ask me what questions do I need to ask the fire department when something comes up? So I'm still in contact with the Traffic and Parking Board.
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it. Delano, sorry you're last on the panel, but that doesn't mean you're the least important. So you've come from a whole different experience than, frankly, what amounts to a small town of relative affluence with, as the chief described, kind of sort of category 2 kind of crimes, right, nuisance crimes. But, of course, any jurisdiction, that can change in a heartbeat because of any incident that can occur. And you probably heard about our shooting here a couple years ago, where some Congress people were shot. So given your experience in the Bronx and at the ATF, I'm sure you had a lot of community, we talked on the phone beforehand about community relations. I mean, looking as an outsider, and I think clearly we do have good community relations through your department, but are there certain things to be aware of in a city like ours, particularly as demographics change so quickly as they have in the past 10 or 20 years? And the second question I'd like you to talk about, if not now, later, since you do have experience at ATF, and I'll get to talk to the chief about this too. We have a gun issue in Virginia. We have people now walking around our farmers market in Old Town, openly carrying AK-47s and assault rifles. Virginia law allows that now. They may not in another month or two, but you've had experience in ATF about sort of the threat that could be posed by people just by sort of exercising their Second Amendment rights. But in terms of both those issues, we can ask them both briefly. What are the things the advice or your observations about how we do our policing versus what you experience in the Bronx, which is I'm sure a much tougher place, but also just briefly in terms of firearms, safety and firearms awareness, how do police balance the constitutional rights of people who want to bear arms with those of other people who are alarmed by seeing that in public?
Certainly. Thanks, and good evening, everyone. Certainly coming from a city like New York, where there's 8 million stories on any given day, certainly we had 2-man police car patrol, and that's what you'll get in a high, dense populated city, as opposed to the chief may have maybe 1-man patrol or 1-partner patrol for this area. So certainly the amount of folks that you are policing is where you would look to put your resources, depending upon the class of the crime. As well, if you have, there's certain vicinities that we police, you'll get some diplomats, you'll get some high-end residents. Certainly that requires a different type of policing than an area where we're constantly responding to firearms crimes and larcenies and things of that nature. So we'll adjust our policing methods according to the area. We also come across language barriers as demographics of a community changes. Sometimes so does we encounter those difficulties in engaging through language. So we'll assign officers to those districts, to those precincts, to help alleviate those situations. Concerning firearms, looking at it from the standpoint of New York being a market state, which is where the firearms end up. I've also had the opportunity to work in Florida, the source states where the guns come from and end up in New York. So it depends upon the type of area that you're working. In New York, we will work the tail end of a firearms trafficking investigation in ATF. In Florida, you work the beginning as to who is the person who is illegally putting the firearm on the street. And in New York, you work it from the fact that this person was recovered with illegally possessing a firearm.
Thanks, that was helpful. Once again, if you have questions you want to ask the panel, someone's got to collect them from the board and bring them on up here so I can read them and sort of digest those. But some of the board members sent me questions ahead of time, and Chief, as you might expect, some of these are for you. There has been a lot of discussion since the 2016 election about the role of local law enforcement, or the pressure on local law enforcement to have to sort of knuckle under to pressure from the federal government to deal with potential illegal immigrants after they commit crimes. And so a couple of my colleagues on the board asked me to ask you to clarify sort of how does your department view demands by ICE that you sort of collaborate on identifying people, and is that sort of a hindrance terms of law enforcement's ability to get sort of, real-time knowledge and intelligence of the community about what's really going on in terms of the kind of even class 2 crimes you talk about. Are people cowed by the idea that if they talk to you, they may also be asked about their citizenship?
That's a really good question. When I first got here in 2017, there was a great deal of concern in parts of our community about whether or not the police department was engaged in immigration enforcement. Immigration enforcement is a civil federal law. It's not a federal criminal law. And we, as police officers in the Commonwealth of Virginia, are not empowered, do not have the authority to enforce that law. The only issue that comes up in this is there is a federal law that says that the sheriff, if he has a legitimate custody person, has to notify ICE for the purposes of a detainer if they so desire to issue one. But for us, we don't get involved in that. Now, we do work with ICE on criminal stuff. For example, they are the lead dog, if you will, the lead agency in dealing with human trafficking across the United States. And so when we have a federal warrant from the FBI or from that task force or whatever else, we will enforce those laws. But again, it's not immigration, it's criminal activity. And so there's a distinction that we have. And so we are in a different position than some of our colleagues, law enforcement-oriented colleagues in other parts of the country, because we do not have the authority to enforce it. So in some respects, it gives us a little bit of distance away from that issue. But the problem is in the perception. So when this came out in 2017, Sheriff Lawhorn and I went and visited the communities across the city that were going to be impacted or had this perception. In fact, I remember going out one night on the way home, took a detour through Chilliwack, and there was nobody on the street. And anyone who knows that area knows that that's not right. So we spent an awful lot of time out there working with the communities, both Dana and myself, as well as our officers, to reassure them that we are here for you. The last thing I want to do is have somebody who needs a police officer be afraid of using 911 when they need it, because that usually doesn't have a good outcome. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as our departmental policy is, we are more concerned about making sure that the public has the services they need so that they can be safe and be protected in this community. And that's our policy, and that's how we do business. In fact, we're prohibited in our policy from enforcing immigration law because we don't have the legal authority in the Commonwealth to do that. What's interesting, I'll tell you a side story. In one of our discussions, Dana and I were out for about 3 hours with one group, and at the end, there was a story that a gentleman put together and said that, oh, I'm sure it was one of your folks that were out there because the guy who came and knocked on the door was wearing a gray shirt. Now, this happened about 3 years before. We were able to actually find out about that incident. It was an ICE agent who was wearing a gray shirt. It was not an APD officer. So again, it's something we have to be on top of. We are always communicating in that way with the community. And what helps us with that is building relationships. It was kind of mentioned earlier about the importance of relationships, and in policing, that's huge. We are a 21st century policing agency. We adopted the task force's recommendations, all the ones that apply to us, except for one, which is body-worn cameras, only because of a fiscal implication, but that may be subject to change a little bit in the near future. But what we do is we try to establish relationships up front with all of our communities. We don't want people to be afraid of the police. If you have a reason to be afraid of the police, we hope it's not because of us. It's because you just are frightened of the police. There are a few people in the community like that. But that doesn't mean we just give everybody a pass. That's why we make traffic stops, including me. But what we do is we report on our activity. We report on our use of force to the Executive Board of the Human Rights Commission twice a year. We provide reports on our traffic enforcement, in other words, traffic stops, using a model that was developed independently by George Mason University, and we publish it every year. We're in the process of looking at our regular activity across that the officers are engaged in, both self-reported as well as dispatched calls for service, in terms of making sure that we don't have bias built into our system. And the one that's most interesting is we asked George Mason University's Center for Evidence-Based Policing, or Evidence-Based Crime Policy, to analyze our beats. Our beats have not been analyzed in decades. And what we looked at over a 20-year period is how our beats have changed, which speaks to what Rod was mentioning in the dynamics in our community and how it's changed, especially over the last 10 years. Crime has changed. The demographics of our communities have changed. We make assumptions based upon our experience in the back, and frankly, those assumptions may be very wrong. We have a lot of, especially on the West End, a lot of changes that have taken place in localized communities. We have an immigrant population that's in there in various ways that you would not imagine. And we're taking a lot of efforts to try and reach out to them by, walking, getting out of the car, saying hi to people, partnering with NOVA. We did a Dia del Nino event in September. We're going to do it again, where we reached out to the community so they can come and be aware of the city services that are provided, not just by the police department, but by the entire city. Those are the kinds of things that build a little bit of trust within a relationship. And when you think of the 21st century policing program, and I invite you to look at our plan, it's on the website. When you look at that, there are 6 pillars. The first 5 all talk about building trust with the community. And that doesn't mean you satisfy everybody, but you build trust with the community. So they know that you're going to be fair, objective, impartial, and treat people with respect. The 6th pillar deals with basically officer wellness. To Corey's point, we don't want officers going out there that aren't mentally and physically fit to do the job, because that's not going to help them and it's not going to help the community we serve. So we are addressing all those issues in our plan. And again, I invite you to look at our website and you'll see that there.
Chief Brown, I want to stay with you and play off of the remarks of Mr. Reid about his experience at ATF and how people react to firearms. The Virginia Legislature General Assembly adjourns on March 7th for their 60-day session, and they've been going through a slew of legislation that address various aspects of guns in public, gun ownership, and we've had I guess, some concern in this community about what I mentioned earlier, which is people showing up at farmers markets with assault rifles, but also the extent to which people can walk into a public building with firearms. Are you up to speed on sort of what's going on right now in Richmond and what is likely to be the outcome of the General Assembly? And how will you welcome or not any action by lawmakers if the governor were to sign any of these bills?
Well, as you can imagine, for those of you that may not be following it, there's been a lot of bills on gun control and gun regulation and the like. Some of them didn't make it through the crossover period, which happened last week from one house to the other. The city's taken a pretty aggressive position on terms of trying to limit the use of guns, especially in public domain areas. I would suggest if you want to know the city's position on all the bills as they came up, you can look at the city website, and you can see they have an update on almost all the city council meetings, plus they also have a listing of that on the website. We right now are in an open carry state. And now there's certain things that you can and can't do in terms of what you carry. The incident at Market Square, and we had a subsequent incident at the Waterfront Commission where one of the individuals came in armed. But they were totally within the law as it currently exists. They had permits for the weapons that they were using. They were within the magazine qualifications to meet the guidelines of the Commonwealth as it stands right now. There are several bills that are working their way and surviving the process. Frankly, the reason I equivocate a little bit is because the bills keep changing. It's hard to keep track of. I've been down there a couple times in Richmond, and the thing moves so doggone quick, you're trying to catch up with it, even something as simple as a traffic bill, let alone the gun bills. We envision that there will be significant changes placed to the governor. The governor's, in fact, his Secretary of Public Safety, Brian Moran, who many of us know from Alexandria, addressed the Virginia Chiefs Association a couple weeks back, and said that the governor is willing to sign some of this gun legislation, which will change our open carry laws, which means that there will be some prohibitions. Some of the ones that I'm personally interested in, I don't think there's a need to have weapons, of that type or anything in a legislative body or a public building. Those are things that we could possibly do if we're given the authority to do it. The police department will enforce whatever the laws of the Commonwealth are. Right now, because we're in an open carry state, we're limited by what we can enforce. If someone's within compliance with the law, we have to respect that till the laws change. Otherwise, we would expose the city to all sorts of liability issues for violating people's Second Amendment rights. So it's up to, Richmond to come up with some guidance that we can all live with.
Well, thanks, Chief, for the update. Let's see what happens. We'll know in the next 2 weeks. Keep your eyes peeled to the Alexandria Times, because one of our board members, Michael Pope, is right now in Richmond. That's why he's not here, because he's covering the legislation. So look for Michael's posts on Twitter and Facebook. Delano, real quick, based on what the Chief said. Now, you're retired from ATF, right?
Yes.
You can speak freely, your own opinion, right? Is it a good thing or a bad thing, based on your experience, to have people being able to walk around with shotguns and assault weapons in public? I mean, is that more or less a plus or a minus for public safety?
Well, I mean, from the standpoint of being a police officer, and in New York, we had really strict gun laws. You would rather have us chasing down legitimate crime as to seeing a citizen that is legally in possession of a firearm, but now we have to take away our time from policing to address this person, because we don't know if that person is a threat, a friend, or a foe. Obviously, I would like to see our time being more spent at combating violent crime as opposed to maybe harassing innocent citizens. But as the Chief stated, there's a lot of legislations that are on the table, red flag laws being one of them. Certainly high-capacity magazines which hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition is another. Law enforcement is just that, law enforcement. So you need to get up with your local leaders, your governors, your Congress folks to address the issues as how you see fit. Because once they come down with the law, we are obliged to enforce it. So just on the matter of red flag laws, I know that that's one of the hot topics and issues. That's dealing with a person who, if they're a danger to themselves or to others, then someone, a family member or a friend, and I believe at this point in time, they're even stating an other person can state to the law enforcement that this person maybe shouldn't be in possession of their firearms. Again, for us, and for me personally, I own firearms, but I have them locked up, I have them secured, I don't just have them floating around. I can tell you where they are at all times. Having worked investigations in where we would go to a person's house and merely ask them where their guns are, and they would give you the wildest stories about not being accountable to those guns. Well, certainly, we're all adults. You have to be accountable to your weapon, and I believe that gun owners, responsible gun owners, would agree as to maybe certain people shouldn't have guns, certainly felons, and people looking to commit crimes, drug dealers, and the like. But from our standpoint, it's about safety. It's about safety for the community and for the police as well. Having lost a lot of friends who were killed in the line of duty, I would say that common sense gun laws need to prevail, but you as the community, you're the ones that set the rules. So you have to talk to your leaders and congressmen, like I stated, and have them abide by your wishes.
Thanks, Dylan. I appreciate that. A couple questions here that from several people. There are two questions for both you, Chief Smedley, and you, Chief Brown. First one's pretty straightforward. Out of your population of officers, how many are bilingual or multilingual? That's the first question. The second question is, do most of your officers of fireplace already live in the area, or are they applying from outside the DMV? And is it because housing is a challenge, or is it that's just too expensive to live here, or that they just choose to live in a place where they're not serving every day. So if you could just talk first, one of you, about sort of multilingual, sort of cultural acclimation of your staff and where that stands and where you want to take it, and then secondly about sort of where do your officers come from?
So I'll talk about the kind of the demographics first. So we actually looked at our demographics about 4 years ago, and subsequently every recruitment cycle we reevaluate that, and we align fairly closely with the city's demographics as it relates to, and we still have work to do as it relates to different language speakers. We have the highest percentage of outside of English is our Spanish speaking, and that is roughly between 5 to 15% of the workforce. I can tell you in the fire service in general, we have much more work to do with our female firefighters. We are in totality about 18% female. And we are working very diligently to look at the different makeup of our workforce to ensure that it reflects the community that we serve. As it relates to where our firefighters and paramedics live, we probably have 7% or less that live in the city.
7%?
7.7 that live in the city, 0.07 that live in the city. It's just what, from a public servant, public safety standpoint, public service standpoint, it's, this is, as you said, a very affluent community, and we're quite often priced out of the area. Historically, in your larger cities, whether it's New York, Washington, D.C., Alexandria, et cetera, the majority of your public safety workforce do not live in the jurisdiction that they serve. And when you look at Virginia, we have about 740 fire departments, which 68% of them are still heavily volunteer supported. The great news about, it's a great news, and it's not such a great thing, where we are surrounded by great departments. And those departments have grown based on the population growth in our region. Previously, to travel from further south to come up to Alexandria was something that was done more than it is now, because there just wasn't as many career fire departments in existence. Loudoun County is really growing. Stafford County is growing. Prince William County, and Fairfax has always been there. So when you look at other locations that are further south that you have more for your money, you don't tend to have a lot of people within the fire service living in the jurisdiction.
Chief Brown.
First of all, we have a number of people that speak a lot of different languages, but the actual percentage I don't know. I will also tell you we're supplemented with volunteers who have helped us on a number of things to get, and they'll do ride-alongs and be available for the communication. And last but not least, we also have access to a service that provides us with field communication with people and translation skills. When we get into working on our community outreach, we try to put people that can know the language in the community that we're working with. So, you don't put somebody like me that speaks, or used to speak German and English, which doesn't, because that's what they taught us in school when I was a kid. That doesn't help me around here much. In fact, it hasn't helped me much in my career at all, wherever I work. Part of it also deals, and I want to talk a little bit about the demographics piece. The class that graduated from our academy that were APD representatives the month before I came on all looked like me. There were 26 of them. We changed our recruiting program. And what we did is we focused on recruiting in the areas in and around Alexandria. A couple reasons. One, they're coming from our community. They're not likely to move as far. Generally speaking, they're coming home. As a result, we've gotten people from surrounding jurisdictions that have a better representation than some of the other areas. For example, Prince William County, for example, we've got people coming from DC. We're focused on local jurisdictions, and as a result, our classes have changed dramatically. The national average, for example, for women for policing is around 13%. We're just under 22%. And the reason being is, I think, a good deal with the recruits that have come in. We've had some classes that have up to almost 50% women. As far as the demographics of ethnicity, we're looking at in one class we had 2/3 of the group were people who are non-white. So again, we're making changes. The biggest issue is the representation in the command staff and moving up. And so we're working on a number of different areas to try and improve and develop our people. We have worked with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and we've gotten people involved in that program. That's a program designed to help stimulate discussions about representation in the policing profession. They're actually the conscience of the profession, and on again, off again, I've been privileged to be a part of that organization, and many, many folks in it. That's where we know each other. And in addition to that, I'm a proud member of the Northern Virginia chapter of Noble, and we have people who are now playing in Noble. Same thing with the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives. We've even set up our own women's program called the Law Enforcement Women of Alexandria for our officers and even the men who wish to support them to do mentoring programs and things like that, so we can keep our females interested in law enforcement with all the things that go on. That's going to be a continuing challenge for law enforcement because generally speaking, it's a non-traditional work thing. So we do a lot of recruiting and a lot of mentoring throughout the selection process to get them in and to get referrals from other women who are already in. They become some of our best recruiters. The affordability issue, as Corey pointed out, is a significant issue in all the urban areas, and Alexandria is no different. What we find is that most of our officers don't live in the city. Many of the ones that are retiring because they've hit the end of their service time are eligible to retire, don't live in the city. What's interesting, a lot of our newer officers do. What they do is they, especially if they're single, they'll join forces with another, and they'll avoid the 95 commute or something like that, and they share a place in town. But affordability is an issue for us. I'm pleased to announce and discuss the city manager's proposed budget for 2021, and in the budget, there is an effort to restore a program that used to exist, which encouraged home ownership within the city for employees, and we'll look forward to seeing if it becomes part of the budget, and it might help some of our folks down the road. But that is going to be a prevailing problem, not only for us, but for jurisdictions across the country where it's very expensive to live. And we just have to deal with that to get good qualified people up here. Another reason to recruit locally, because they're already here. They're just coming to work. So,
Thanks, Chief. Jay and Delano, I'm not ignoring you, but as you can imagine, we have the two chiefs here for the first time, and a number of questions have been asked about two related things. And they both have to do to the extent to which your departments are consulted in a serious way when the city wants to do one of two things, either approve large developments, which bring in buildings, people, residents, whatever. And of course, we all lived through the road diet recently where there were some exchanges of emails revealed through Freedom of Information Act requests that showed actually there were some concerns on the part of first responders about that change in Seminary Road. I know when the city does things, they're always sort of checking off the checklist. They got to check with the police department and the fire department. But do you feel you're really is the mayor here, anybody? I guess? Okay. Are you really being paid attention to the extent you want to be so that after the fact, it doesn't come out that, my God, there were emails from the fire department saying to the city, whoa, don't do that. Or because every time we incur costs through new development or changes in traffic patterns or mass transit, it somehow, doesn't it affect your operations? And how do you both feel about the extent to which you're being taken seriously as a first responder, essentially, to city plans in those regards?
It's up to you.
Oh, flip a coin,
So-
guys.
Let's address the elephant in the room. So I took over as acting July 3rd of 2019. Prior to my predecessor leaving, we received an email around the June timeframe to reopen the discussion about the road diet, the Complete Street program. What I quickly found out in my position is you have to ensure that people are clear on how information flows into your department and outside of your department, right? So we all have various people in different divisions out of the department that gain relationships from being here for so many years. So there's nothing that one of our paramedics reaches out to the SWAT team for the police department because they're a SWAT medic. And there's discussions that happen every day that I don't know what is talked about, but if something officially leaves or is the position of the fire department, that needs to come through the office of the fire chief. So we understood that there were some internal challenges with how information is entered into our department and how it officially leaves our department. So what all the foiable information that took place revealed is that there were many discussions that took place and there were some disconnects of how it was flowing internally in our department. So that's one thing. In addition to that, there was many different pieces of a discussion in moments in time that were discussed back and forth to evaluate what was being posed so that we can see if this was reasonable to execute. That is the pieces of the puzzle that were foiable, not the entire thing. We realized internally, in which we fixed, processing things in and out of the department. We realized with all of our stakeholder agencies, including the police department, that there needs to be a clear, defined process that continuously is improved, right? We start things, we go through that process, we find new ways and better ways to address it, and we fix it and make it better. This is all part of the growing process to ensure that we're putting out the best product. The fire department's standpoint is we did provide input to what you see on Seminary Road. And as you've seen in the Gazette and the Times, we have never not responded to your call for service. And if you don't, I've talked to a couple people here who had a father that was a fire chief, who had a son that was in the fire department, and you two both know if there was something wrong with anything in the fire service, my personnel would let me know this. And to date, no one has said that there was any challenges with traversing the roadway based on the road diet. There is always challenges traversing the roadway based on we have congestion in the city. We do that every day, whether it's morning or evening and when there's a special event. That happens all the time. But as long as there are several measures that are put in place, which they were put in place, we can traverse the roadway and respond to any call for service that comes our way.
Chief, do you think you're being listened to as much as you think you should be on these issues of development or traffic changes?
Yeah, we do. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the 3-hour city council meeting along with my fire chief friend here on the Seminary Road. What I'd rather talk about, though, is the process, because that's the important part of this. In every case, there's lessons to be learned. We learned a few lessons as well, but I want to assure you of something. We have, for example, planning and zoning sends us the planning, long-term planning proposals so we can look at them and the impact it would have on us. Yeah, for example, we're doing all the development on Eisenhower. Well, that project was approved, several years ago, before I got here, but we got a copy of the plan, we've gone through it, and we make adjustments. The same thing with some of the other developments that are taking place and the rehabilitation that's taking place in various parts of the community. If you think about it, for example, up by Braddock and West King up there, that huge development that used to be where the hospital is, that's going to house thousands of people, 1,000 or so people. So that's going to change our calls for service and our request for service. We were aware of that. We've looked at it. We've looked at the impact that's there. As far as TENS, that's Transportation Environmental Service, for those who don't know. Tess and the police department get together every other month on a regular basis, and we talk about everything from parking to redevelopment to paving and everything else, and some of the safety implications that we pick up out throughout the year. We also have meetings in between then when things are coming up that are problematic, and we have real frank discussions about trying to deal with the issues, and our position is always the safe use of our roadways. You know, I hate to say it, everyone loves a pretty roadway. I like one too, I live in the city, but from my professional issue, that's for Tess to do. What I'm concerned about is it's a safe roadway and it meets the needs and doesn't make things more difficult. That said, Tess has been very receptive to us in those issues. And so we will continue to work together with Tess and with our colleagues in the fire department. We have regular conversations. In fact, we have the same circuit. We go to things on, you name it, everything. Now it's coronavirus. And we're dealing with coronavirus almost on a weekly basis anymore, making sure that we're prepared should something happen here in the city. That's what you pay us to do, and that's what we have to do. And I mean, it gets to the point, if you look at it, it's not just within the department, within the departments in the city. Do you know that every time ABC changes a regulation or a license, that they notify the police department, and we send that to patrol, and also to community outreach so they can understand exactly what's happening in their businesses within the beats. This is going to be a challenge for the city going forward because, as many of you have seen, we're not building laterally, we're building vertically. And so for us, we have to think in terms of 3 dimensions, because if you look at a multi-story dwelling, you know, multi-family dwelling, and you spread that out in a 2-dimensional sense, it could be 20 or 30 blocks, depending on how big that building is. And those are potential calls for service for us. So we are looking at different ways to budget. An example of the one we're looking at is the model that was used up in Tyson's Corner by Fairfax County. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to explore to stay ahead of the game. And again, what's been very helpful for us is the work that's been done by some of the other departments and what they've shared with us.
Thank you, Chief. Delano, this came in for you. This speaks to your experience with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. How has the Black Lives Matter movement made it more difficult or more challenging for managers in law enforcement who have to be African American to be able to enforce the law in a perceived fair way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, certainly. I am the vice president of the Noble DC Metropolitan Chapter, and I've had vast experiences in working with crowd controls and things of that nature. So when you're talking about Black Lives Matter, Noble is engaged in that. We're at the forefront in that. We are members of the community. We all don't wear uniforms 24/7. So when we take off our uniforms, certainly we live in the community and we're involved and engaged in the community. We ensure that there's equity in the administration of justice, and we provide public service to all communities, not just communities of color. So we engage with the folks who, and we're at the front table with folks who have issues with law enforcement. That's the only way that you can help to break down some of the barriers, some of the stereotypes, some of the misconceptions that go on during demonstrations. I mean, as the chief stated, partnerships are a major part of what goes on within law enforcement, but it's also partnership with the community as well. Noble does an excellent outreach program. It's called The Law in Your Community. It's training that we put out there that really helps the community to know best practices on engaging with law enforcement, be it a car stop, being a personal confrontation on the street, or being within the residence. And we put this on, and the chief is, again, a partner with Noble and a member, and has helped us in putting these on in various areas. So, and I believe there's one coming up in a couple of weeks.
There is.
And so these are something that you could look further into and request through your representatives. Eastern McDonald is the president here, and they have an excellent working relationship. Our national president is C.J. Davis, and she's the police chief in Durham, North Carolina. Our executive director, Mr. Dwayne Crawford, he's in Atlanta. We have a vast array of experience and knowledge, and we have a career team also, I want to mention that cultivates a lot of young police officers who were in ranks of lieutenant and above that can bring the experience to the Alexandria Police Department. So we'll be sharing some of those names with your chief going forward. I myself has been the on-scene commander in a case that you guys will know here concerning the DC sniper. I was one of the on-scenes there when we caught those folks, and make no mistake, there was a loud cheer once by the command staff and by everyone involved once that was done. So I would say that Noble is remaining committed and engaged with not only Black Lives Matter, but we have operations with Latino folks, Asian, Caucasian. We run the gamut. Our deal is to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities, and that only starts with open dialogue, frankness, and truthfulness.
Chief Brown's got a brief comment here.
Yeah, let me add something. Many of you may not know the history of Noble, and Noble was created 50 years ago out of the 70s by individuals who really were very interested in trying to improve the conscious and awareness of law enforcement. And over the years, Noble has been recognized in the profession as the conscience of law enforcement. They call it as they see it. I first became aware of Noble and its history through a mentor of mine, Bill Kelly, who was one of the founders with the Highway Patrol in California. And Bill taught me the value of Noble, and over the years I've been able to be a member or work with Noble on a number of things. And they are indeed a very valuable asset, not just for the African American community, but for all communities. And I've seen them do that in Los Angeles. I've seen them do that in other parts of California. I've seen them do it back here. And so we're very privileged to have such a robust Noble presence in the National Capital Region. And we're very privileged to have the opportunity to partner with them.
Thank you, Chief.
Likewise.
This one's for Jay Johnson and Chief Smedley, I guess, in anywhere you want to go to. It's really more about, well, this is in the news today. I mean, what is the action plan to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus or any other kind of pandemic? I mean, are the volunteers trained as well as the in-house sort of full-time staff to deal with contagious diseases? I mean, is that something that you guys train for? I mean, what happens, for example, if there's an outbreak in Alexandria? Do you guys have a role in that?
So when you look at specific infections or viruses, the fire service handles things based on the type of spread, and we're not scientists, so we don't have a specific approach to each particular case that comes about. We have a strategy to, one, stop the spread, two, address the sicknesses that we're dealing with, three, get them to the appropriate care, and then also provide insight and communication to our partners. For example, health department, our regional partners from the regional hospital system, the emergency management offices, our communicators, who in turn will get information to the CDC. So part of that is ensuring that we understand the type of situation that we're facing. We understand the best practices to address that. We ensure that we provide insight to our our first responders and our stakeholder agencies on the proper course of action to take. We also work with our Department of Emergency Communications, who is that catch-all or that repository of the majority of ways that we get contacted. So they have the insight, they're fielding those questions, and they are providing insight so that the system won't get overwhelmed, because it can get overwhelmed very quickly. So there are things to look at to ensure we have the proper understanding of what we're dealing with, the proper equipment, and communicating with our stakeholder agencies to ensure that we can address whatever situation that comes by.
Thank you, Chief Brown. And then we're going to go to kind of a lightning round. I've got a whole lot of questions here I want to get to before we're done in 15 minutes.
The coronavirus, I do want to talk a little bit about the coronavirus, only because that's of some concern for a variety of reasons. It's all over the media and everyone's worried about anyone who coughs or sneezes around them. We are in the process, and I say that now because I was sick for about 2 weeks, but it wasn't the virus, okay? It was a real bad cold. That said, we're meeting seriously about this issue. The lead on this for us is the Virginia Department of Health, Dr. Stephen Herring. We have been working with him. The fire department's there, the police department's there. We're all talking about how do we deal with this on a minimal scale when there's things like quarantine, and then more on a significant scale if we have to go into isolation. We've been working with the city attorney's office to make sure that we have all the proper things in place for legal authority to do things that we need to do to keep people in isolation or quarantine if they don't want to do it voluntarily. We're also having meetings to discuss what do we do if we have a mass situation where we have to isolate or quarantine large segments of our community. Those conversations are taking place. They've been taking place every week for the last several months. And they will continue until we get this done. And every time we have a meeting, we think of something else we've got to do. But that's part of what you do for planning for these. Right now, we do not have that issue. We hope that we don't have that issue in this city, but we're making every effort to try and do that, and also to protect our first responders and our medical technicians across the city, because if we get into that situation, we're going to have to keep them healthy so that we can continue to operate. But the city's been fully engaged in the planning efforts, and these are not just, we're actually looking at doing exercises and things like that to test some of those things. But we're keeping our fingers crossed and saying our prayers that we don't have a situation involving that virus here in the city.
And so, just real quick, so my former position in Alexandria was the emergency manager. So this is rising to the level of everyone's attention because of the capacity that could happen across the world. But these kind of things, from a planning standpoint, happens on a regular basis, right? So this is not something that we had to quickly figure something out, come together and make a plan. The plan exists. As the Chief Brown stated, we've had a tabletop exercise. We're doing more exercises, not only in the city, but with our regional partners. Obviously, the school system is a significant part of that process. Our Parks and Rec is another significant part of that process. In case we have to open up a shelter or a center, there are many things behind the scenes that take place. And when something like this happens, it's not as if we have to create something. It already exists. We just have to ensure that we understand what we're dealing with and that we are putting everything in place and posturing correctly so we can be proactive and not reactive.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. Let's go to some quick questions and quick answers. Jay, yes. A couple people asked questions following up on your description of what the volunteers do. You say you have EMTs or you have firefighters. And I know that we've talked in the past about the unhappiness your cohort of volunteers had with the previous administration, where they tried to make everybody into both a fireman and an EMT, and what the result of that was. Can you elaborate sort of on why you think that may be not the best thing for certain citizens or taxpayers to have to deal with? I think there was some attrition at the time, but and why does it work so well for volunteers to sort of specialize in one or the other skill as opposed to being asked to do both?
Well, for many years, you had sole fighter, a firefighter, EMT, and a medic. And with the medics, they're constantly training on medic procedures, because they're constantly, their training is ongoing, always new protocols from the hospital or whatever. And then you have the firefighters, and they have their training. And as a taxpayer, and I'm speaking as a taxpayer, I'm not speaking for the fire department, okay? But I'm speaking, I think you should be a firefighter, EMT, and I think you should be a paramedic, and that's it. Because it's just too much training. It's just way too much training to absorb when you're both a firefighter and a medic, especially in the street. And also, medics are constantly on the road all the time, on the calls constantly. And there's more medic calls than there are fire calls. And there's more BLS calls than there are ALS calls. So the medic units are constantly going.
What's BLS versus ALS?
It's basic life support, and ALS is advanced, which is your heart attacks or trauma patients like shootings or stabbings and stuff like that. And I believe that you should be a sole provider, because you just can't one day be a firefighter and the next day be a paramedic. To me, it just doesn't work. And I'd rather have a I'd rather have a full-time medic coming to my house than a half one. And that's just me, okay? And I believe that the chief here are looking at all those avenues, okay? What works for Fairfax County may not work for us in the city, and what works for us may not work for Fairfax County. So I think he's going to look at the different scenarios and see whether or not we can do a better job on improving both firefighting and
Chief Smedley, does Jay have is he reading you right on this?
So I'm a proponent of defining the problem prior to going down the road for the solution. So what I know that's happened since 2014 is in Alexandria Fire Department, we went to a dual role provider process, and that's what Jay is alluding to. So previously, we were single role medics, paramedics, and or firefighter, basic EMTs, emergency medical technicians. And in 2014, we started transitioning to dual role providers. So previously, and I haven't done this in a while since I've left my former jurisdiction, I was both. I'm still both. I haven't rode on a fire truck or an ambulance in quite a while, but I was a firefighter as well as a paramedic, and I was confident when I was practicing, but whatever was in front of me that I could handle, whether that was a fire or medic. So what I have already charged my deputy chief of emergency medical services is to convene a task force, not only of internal personnel, but he's going to be reaching out to community members, and if there's someone on Agenda Alexandria that is interested, we welcome that. He's right now at the EMS Council, and he's doing the same thing with resident members of that board to really take a look at where we came from and where we are currently, to see how we're doing and do we need to do a course correction or keep down this road. So I can't answer that question until I do the due diligence of evaluating where we are and where we say we wanted to be. And as soon as that's done, I can make a very definitive answer on which direction we're moving forward.
Well, thank you.
And I'll like to say something, and I appreciate Chief doing that.
Use the microphone.
Okay.
Use the microphone.
Okay, all right, sorry. You heard me? Yeah, I appreciate the fire chief doing that. I really do.
Well, thank you. That broke some new ground. You know, there are lots of questions I didn't get to ask, and I wish I did have time, but we always promised to get you out by 8:30 so you can go home and enjoy the rest of your evening. There are two last questions that have come up that both go to you, Chief Brown. One is something we talked about, and some people have asked about, which is body cameras. But the other one is pretty simple. It looks as if Virginia's about to decriminalize marijuana. How do you feel about that? Is that going to...
Well, I spent 34 years in a state that did that some time ago, so the law enforcement community is empowered to enforce the law, and the responsibility we have is to enforce the law. And so if we decriminalize marijuana, we'll enforce it in accordance with the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia. That's a decision for the policymakers to make, not for the police officers to make.
Well, let me just interject here and just ask you this. I mean, but before, I mean, as of right now, I mean, what I'm told by police liaisons I've worked with at the Delaware Citizens Association, there's still a lot of busts that are getting made all the time, particularly in some of our low-income communities, for simple possession of marijuana. That will now be less of an issue in the criminal court system, right?
Yeah, that's true, and I'll defer to the Commonwealth Attorney not to pass the buck, but Brian Porter is dealing with this issue. They have the city has a position on it in support of decriminalization, at least in some of the bills that are out there, several of them. Again, for the police department, the decriminalization really is an impact more often on the court system and the criminal history of the individual. That we'll leave that to them. We'll enforce the laws that are going to come out of Richmond as far as marijuana use. The issue, I want to also talk a little bit about the body-worn cameras. In the budget proposed by the city manager, there's a position for a sergeant in our department. The position is designed for us to come back with a comprehensive multi-year plan and budget for the implementation of body-worn cameras. One of the issues that's been curtailing our movement, and that's the only issue on the 21st century policing that we couldn't move forward on, was frankly the city was facing some significant fiscal issues. The sewer issue and the capital improvement, which in the school development issues, all of which we're at a point now where we can present information to the city council next fall. And our goal is to develop policies, propose policies, implementation protocols, costing effects, not only for the police department, but as many of the other experiences of other departments, is to also include the costing requirements and the staffing requirements for others that may be affected by that policy, which includes the Commonwealth Attorney and how do they handle discovery motions and how you work around those in a criminal proceeding, FOIA requests from the City Attorney's Office, even to the extent of hiring someone who can edit video evidence so that we can protect the privacy of individuals who just happen to be in the frame in the wrong place in the wrong time. That said, there's a lot of complicated issues, but we've been studying it for the last year or so. In fact, I've participated in several panels with the National Police Foundation and with IECP to discuss this issue. That's the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Plus, we've also looked at research, not only by George Mason, but others, in terms of what's happening across the country, what's successful and what isn't. Our goal is to front load that position, get somebody working on this rather quickly so that we can have something for the City Council to evaluate in the next fall for the 2022 budget cycle, and move forward. To show you how important this is, this County of Fairfax started a program, did a pilot project in 2 districts. It cost them $6 million to do it, and they ran out of money before the time was up. They're now budgeting a 3-year, $36 million project. Now, they're much bigger than we are in terms of agency size, but the resistance is not coming from the police department. Most of our officers want the body cameras because it legitimizes, in many cases, their interactions with the public. I'm sure there's some that wouldn't want it because they have troubles in that area, but like everyone, we hope that they'll come around. But if we're going to be transparent and that technology is there and we can afford it, as a city, the police department's willing to go forward with it.
Thank you, Chief. Before I ask you to recognize the fine work that our panel has done tonight, I think you all should give yourselves a round of applause. You've hung in here. I don't see anybody on their cell phone, and you've had really great questions to ask, so thank you so much for coming and being part of Jane Alexandria. I hope you'll come back another time, but in the meantime, let's give our 4 panelists a round of applause.
I think everybody in the room got a lot out of it, and also everybody who's going to be watching this on the YouTube video. And Rod, thank you for doing a great job moderating. Let's hear it for Rod. Thank you. So Our next program is going to be 4 weeks tonight. It's going to be Old Blight, New Progress, Transformational Changes in North Old Town. So that's going to be on March 23rd. The flyer's on your table. We're still going to determine the location, so please just check into the website, and we hope all of you will be back here in 4 weeks. And